Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jared Carney. Welcome to the 2014 Milken Institute Global Conference and the panel that you've all chosen to come to today and view on the web is The Arctic, the New Frontier. We're joined by an eminently distinguished panel that I hope conveys to you the sense of excitement, the sense of accessibility, the opportunities and the risks that are inherent in what is arguably the world's last great frontier. Last great frontier for physical infrastructure developments, last great frontier for economic development, human capital development, so many of the things we here at the Milken Institute care so very much about. The panel today is constituted from my right, your left, starting with Mr. Terry Odla, who's the president of the Inuit Community and Nation of Canada. Next to him, we're very honored to have President Olafur Grimsson, President of Iceland. Not many people here may know this, but President Grimsson is the longest serving democratically elected leader in the world. On my left, yes. On my left is Mr. Torben Moger Pedersen, who's the CEO of Pansen Denmark. It's a $30 billion US assets under management pension fund. And of course, he has a unique perspective on Greenland, which we'll hear much more about. And rounding out the panel is our hometown hero, Professor Lawrence Smith. He's the chair of the Department of Geography from the University of California, Los Angeles, and he happens to be one of the world's great experts on the Arctic. So with that, I'd like to set the scene with the person who has probably had the greatest vision for the Arctic and its opportunities, and that's President Grimsson. President Grimsson?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come here all the way from Iceland to talk about the Arctic. I realize it might sound a bit strange in LA to argue the point that the Arctic is now fast becoming the most interesting economic and political playing field in the world. But I think it's very important to realize that 100 years ago, when my father was young, the Arctic was still unknown to the Western world. That was the time when the first so-called explorers were going there, although people had lived there for thousands of years. And then during the second half of the 20th century, it was also a no-go zone because of the militarization that was there, both on the Soviet side and on the Western side. So it is, in fact, only in the last 15 years or so that this very important part of planet Earth has become a territory of cooperation and a territory of relevance to all of us. And there are, of course, many reasons. One is obvious and clear that the Arctic is the alarming part of approaching climate change, where the melting of the Arctic sea ice causes extreme weather patterns, extraordinary destructions in cities, not only in the United States, but also in China and elsewhere. But in addition, it is the largest reservoir of untapped natural resources found anywhere probably in the world. Not only minerals and rare metals, oil and gas and hydropower, but also ocean resources of great magnitude. And with the melting of the Arctic sea ice, we are already seeing the opening of new sea routes, linking Asia to America and Europe in the same way as the Suez Canal did in its time. But because of the lack of cooperation and the unknown aspect of this territory, it is almost like a new planet. And we have to come together, the nations of the world, to cooperate and decide how are we going to approach this territory. And the fundamental shift that took place last year was after the ministerial decision of the Arctic Council. From now on, more than half of the G20 countries, I say that again, more than half of the G20 countries are now in one way or another formally at the Arctic table. And the reason why Japan, China, India, South Korea, France, Britain, Germany want to be at the Arctic table is the strong significance for the 21st and the 22nd century economies. But it also, and that's my final point, perhaps one of the most crucial areas where the American and Russian cooperation, not confrontation, cooperation in the 21st century will be tested. And next year, the US will take on the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, the first time since it became a treaty-making organization. And it will be an important role for the American business community, the American scientific community, and the American democratic community to have an impact into the leadership of the US of this important organization and this important territory in the coming years.
Thank you. Lawrence Smith, you've made a study of the Arctic and you've actually put out a report recently. Can you give us some greater context into just what some of these dynamics are yielding right now in terms of economics, some of the trade route impacts that have happened and that are occurring, and some of the risks that we need to be aware of?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll just start by saying as an Arctic scientist who has been visiting and studying and mapping the 8 Arctic countries for 22 years, I mean, that the pace of the physical changes transpiring there are unequivocal. And perhaps the only thing that's surprised me more has been the pace very recently, most recently in the last 5 to 7 years, of public interests and business interests and environmental concerns in this part of the world. So all eyes truly are on this place, and with good reason. For example, some of my own research at UCLA, if you look at slides 26, we've been taking the latest state-of-the-art climate models and running them through an analysis for shipping potential to show how shipping possibilities will evolve in the coming years and decades. This is the current situation today for with the blue lines being an ordinary open water ship seeking passage from Europe to East Asia. This is the quickest possible route if you wanted to get between Rotterdam, for example, and the Bering Strait. This is the situation today, and the next slide shows what the situation is becoming. Boom. Viable passages over the Northern Sea Route, through the Northwest Passage sometimes, and even for those industries who wish to spend the money on an ice-strengthened ship, a so-called Polar Class 6 vessel, those are the red lines, even taking the shortest direct path to meet right over the top, right over the North Pole. So the physical changes really are quite dramatic.
So Lawrence, what's the financial calculation that goes along with that improvement in speed?
Oh, none whatsoever. This is purely based on the geophysics of sea ice. There are many, many other, probably more important economic factors that would determine whether any skipper would seek to drive a vessel over the top of the North Pole. But these are the physical transformations that are happening.
Fascinating. So you want to give a little bit more color on the physical transformations that are happening, maybe for the audience's benefit, the impact to the permanent ice pack as opposed to the seasonal ice pack?
Absolutely. This, of course, is this map, I should hasten to add, is for late summer conditions. The ice will always return into wintertime. This is not a year-round competitor to the Suez or Panama Canals. This is a summertime opportunity. With regard to the permanent sea ice, or permanent ice pack in the Arctic, well, if you do go to slide number 24, I can show you firsthand what the top of the Greenland ice sheet did look like in the summer of 2012 when I visited. That is the top of the Greenland ice sheet. Not a vast plain of snow and ice, but covered with tremendous flowing blue rivers. So this is a ice mass of tremendous global importance. It does contribute to sea level rise. It's not an immediate near-term threat, but it will be continuing to push up sea levels in the centuries ahead. A nearer-term potential threat for infrastructure and economics in the region would be a risk posed to land-built infrastructure and land transportation systems. For example, if you have a look at slide 34, you'll see what can happen when permafrost thaws, damaging the built foundations of buildings and pipelines and so forth. This was a perfectly fine apartment building in Chersky, Siberia. One morning, the tenants woke up to see cracks in their walls. 3 days later, the building tumbled in a pile of rubble. If you could turn to the next slide, you could see the other
35.
significant threat for Canada and Alaska in particular, and Russia, which is a declining viability of winter roads. These are temporary seasonal ice roads that spread across the landscapes in many flat and wet areas and often are the only way that economic activity can be viable. So these are under threat as the winters become milder and the climate warms. So the real future here in the Arctic is not a land-based one, it is a maritime future.
That's interesting, a maritime future. So Terry Odla, please tell us a little bit more about the community that you represent, but more importantly, the status of native populations across the Arctic, because I think not many people may understand that in fact there are many people who've been living in northern climes for quite a long time.
That's correct, and I'm very proud to be here and thank Milken Institute for inviting me and the Canadian Consul General. I represent about 60,000 people in Canada's north, but we cover or call our homeland, which is equivalent to that the size of India, and we've been able to successfully enter into treaties with the Canadian government where we're now considered one of the largest private landholders in the world. The actual area of land that we have title to is equivalent to that of Spain and Portugal. So it's a vast amount of land that we control. Land tenure is no longer an issue in Canada's Arctic, and we've been very successful in ensuring that the Inuit are involved throughout the process of any development in the Arctic. So when it comes to anyone stepping on the land, we meet with the company, and then we discuss terms and conditions and actually discuss the lease arrangements as well. So in a sense, the Inuit are very open to business, and we want to do it on our own terms, but we're very patient and pragmatic, and we feel that Canada's Arctic is really the next frontier, and we're open for development. It's just a matter of how we can work together and partner and not only become the employees, but as employers as well.
But what's the status of other peoples around the Arctic Circle for the benefit of the audience?
if you turn to slide 40, which my companion from the UCLA had put together, that shows you an area of the landmass in question. In northern Canada, you're looking at 3 time zones, again, about the size of India, and we've been quite successful in negotiating these modern treaties, land claim agreements with the federal government, where the federal government or the Canadian government has ceded actual title to lands to the Inuit, of whom I represent. In Greenland, you have, in Denmark and Greenland, they've negotiated the Greenland Home Rule or self-government, as well as in Alaska, you have pockets of areas that the Alaskan Inuit have actually negotiated quite successfully. Northern Russia is another issue. I'm also the vice president for the International Circumpolar Council, which is Inuit that span across the circumpolar world in Greenland, Canada's north, Alaska, and northern Russia. And we have come out with a declaration on Inuit sovereignty as well as Inuit resource development. And if you ever get the chance, read up on those, and it actually shows you that Inuit are very pragmatic in developing the Arctic.
Thank you. Torben, maybe you could go a little bit into greater depth about the evolution of Greenland and its status and self-rule for the audience's benefit.
Yes, in the 70s, Greenland was granted what you call home rule, and this was developed into what we now call self-rule, which was granted in 2009, meaning that, among other things, that Greenland has full control over all natural resources, both at sea and at land. Meaning that the potential income from tax and royalties from exploration of these natural resources is expected to be the primary source of income for the Greenland society for the coming decades. This is not so this has not been a decision or agreement without conflicts, and actually the self-rule declaration has some contradiction in it, as on the one side Greenland has full control over natural resources, minerals, but on the other hand any issues dealing with security and foreign policy is an issue for the Danish government, which has actually created a very intensive discussion actually these days on the extraction and potential export of uranium from mining facilities in the southern part of Greenland. And this has not yet been concluded, where the Danish government are opposed to exploit and export uranium, while the relatively new Greenland government is in favor for doing this. So there are some conflicts to be solved before you will see this mature. But I'm here as a representative from the investor community, and as a Danish pension fund, we of course have a natural interest in Greenland, and the ambitions in Greenland, actually in most of Arctic, are very high, and opportunities are big, but so are the risks. And for private investors and pension funds, it all comes down to risk-adjusted rates of return. That will also be the case when we are discussing investments in the Arctic. On the one hand, you have these very large opportunities. There are very large reserves of both energy and minerals deposits, and these resources will represent a very important source of income for the region in form of royalties and taxation, as I said before. And as we heard before, the climate change has created new shipping routes which give us the possibility of substantially shorter distances and days, and also creates a need for new types of infrastructure. But in order to exploit the potential of these new shipping routes, you have to construct new bunker facilities, new bunker harbors. You have to build, in order to establish a mining industry, you have to establish roads, harbor facilities, housing facilities for the workforce. So there's a very large area of potential investments to do here. But on the other hand, risks are also high, and to some degree of another kind of what you see as an investor in other parts of the world. Operational risks working in the Arctic very quickly turns into environmental risks, and the risk of, for example, oil spill is an issue which actually has not been tackled yet. There's discussions on this issue, but there have not been defined sufficient procedures to deal with how to deal with the potential risks of, for example, oil spill. And for institutional investors, these type of risk quickly turns into reputational risks. So this is a group of risk factors which makes it relatively difficult to calculate the business case. I would also point to what I would call the political risk factor. To be a long-term investor in, let's say, infrastructure project in the Arctic, you need to have confidence in the stability of the regulatory regimes for 20, 30, 40 years going ahead. And without stable regulatory regimes, it will be very hard to attract private capital. And one of the regulatory issues of great importance is the tax and royalty regimes. It's very important for the governments in the area to accept that if you have to attract private mining companies and private investors, you should stick to stable and, let's say, transparent tax regimes. I'm not advocating low taxes or low royalties. Actually, I think there are room for quite high royalties on many of these activities. But it's important that you should not fear so retroactive changes going forward. That would. Yes.
Sorry, I just,
no, of course.
thank you. I want to give the president an opportunity to respond to the question of political risk. You know, from an outside perspective, I don't think there's a lot of clear understanding of what some of the political structures are, both national and multilateral, in the Arctic. So if you could give us perspective on that, and then talk about where you see risk and not.
Well, maybe to get your attention, I would say that you would be hard put to find an area in the world with so little political risk. And the reason for that is that the Arctic is a combination of US territory, Canada territory, the Nordic countries with their established rule of law and democracies, plus Russia. Russia, of course, is somewhat a special case. But they govern their own landmass according to their own rules. And then you have the case of Greenland, which is a bit sensitive because the present government of Greenland wants independence. And I think if they get that, they will be perfectly trusted, like the Danes or the Icelanders and the Norwegians, to run that without political risks. So I don't think political risk is really a factor for business community to enter the Arctic. There are other risks that are more important in the Arctic. But I think it's very important for an American corporate investment audience to realize that, first of all, this is America's backyard. This is your own backyard. And already prominent companies from Asia, from Europe, are placing themselves in your backyard. You have Costco, the largest Chinese company, already sending last year a container ship from Shanghai to Rotterdam, realizing it took 10 days shorter. They saved a lot of fuel.
Slide 47.
And now the Chinese, the South Koreans on the other, are aggressively building commercial fleets to utilize this opening, even if it is only 3 months. It's quarter of the year. And just make the calculation when you get back home. If a quarter of the cargo container traffic between Asia and Europe and America goes through the Northern Sea Route, what enormous amount it is. But there will be more than a quarter because it's much cheaper, so people will try to put more into that window of opportunity than the actual proportion of the period of the year. In addition, the second largest harbor in Germany, Bremenport, one of the largest harbors in the world, is already entering into agreement with us in Iceland to place themselves to look for building a global harbor in the northeastern part of Iceland. You have Singapore taking a very active role in the Arctic. It's a wake-up call, I think, for the rest of the world, how active Singapore already is. Why is that? Because they realize that with the change of the sea route, and they think long ahead, they think decades ahead, the position of Singapore as a hub in global trade will actually change. So they are now seeking partnerships up there. You have similarly mining companies, you have investment companies like Guggenheim, who took an active role in the first assembly of the Arctic Circle, which I helped to establish last year in Iceland. Will come together again, a gathering of people from the business community, the investment community, the scientific community, the indigenous community. Because what we need in the Arctic, and that's what we established with the Arctic Circle, is a kind of a Davos or a Milken Global Conference of the Arctic, where all these different players, all these different constituencies come together. And I've been in this Arctic business for a long time. And I have to tell you, the level of pace, as I was saying, the change in the last 2 or 3 years is phenomenal, is phenomenal. 3 years ago, in every meeting, I had been Asian leader, whether it was the Prime Minister of China, the leadership of Singapore, or in South Korea, the first item they wanted to discuss is the Arctic. And therefore, it is very important for the United States, if you want to maintain your role as an active player in the global economy, If you want to partner with Canada, with Greenland, with the other Nordic countries, and with the other arrivals from Asia and Europe who are already wanting to get there, it's very important that the American investment and corporate community, together with Washington, definitely Washington, gets more engaged in the evolution and the deal making and the cooperation and the dialogue in the Arctic. Because otherwise, my dear friends, you will wake up in 10 or 20 years' time and find important players from Asia and Europe already having established positions there, so it will be very difficult for the United States then to try to catch up. That's one of the reasons why I'm traveling around the US now to talk about the Arctic, because it's important for my country. It's important for my country that the US gets actively, positively, aggressively engaged in the Arctic.
Well, let's talk about that, since the U.S. is assuming chairmanship of the Arctic Council next year. Lawrence, if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. still hasn't signed the Law of the Sea Convention. You want to talk a little bit about what that is and
Sure.
what the significance of that is?
Yes, the United States is the only Arctic country of the 8 that has not ratified the treaty. This is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which for reasons I don't think we have time to get into here, but it does, in my view, in the view of many of my colleagues, place the U.S. at a disadvantage with regard to the offshore sovereignty extensions to the ocean seafloor that are transpiring, and this is a legal process, fairly calm, peaceful process that are transpiring to extend offshore sovereignty of the seafloor, offshore of the 5, 6, depending how exactly you define countries with frontage on the Arctic Ocean. That said, no one is seriously challenging the sovereignty of the United States north of the North Slope of Alaska. So in many ways, this is somewhat of a red herring argument, a little bit. In fact, the U.S. has been aiding Canada with the mapping of its offshore claims. So the United States is very much playing very well with all of the other actors in this region, just to underscore the point that President Grimson made about this, in fact, being a very peaceful model place for international collaboration. And the U.S. is an Arctic nation. This is something I think many of us sitting in this room really often don't think about. But if I were to show you a map of the state of Alaska superimposed on the lower 48, you would be shocked. It covers most of the country west of the Mississippi River. It's an absolutely enormous, massive land. And Alaska itself is tiny compared to the rest of the lands and seas surrounding the circumpolar Arctic. So, and just if I may add one, just build upon what President Grimson said about the shipping activities and so forth, it's not simply about shorter trade routes either. If you go to slide number 28, I'd like to show you, we don't need any fancy computer models to see what I'm talking about. What the map will show you, this is the pattern of actual ship traffic in the Arctic region during winter when the ice is at its fullest extent. And the next slide, I'm going to show you what happened 6 months later when the summer came and the ice melted back. Boom. The ice pulls
What year
back.
is this, Lawrence?
This would be slides number 28 and 29.
Right. But and this is activity in which year?
This is 10 years ago. This is in 2004 when I could get my hands on the transponder data. So the ice retreats and the ships pour in. It's as simple as that. But look at the geography of this. This is not cost. These are not container ships sniffing out a longer route between Ningbo and Rotterdam. This is local destinational traffic within the Arctic itself. This is oil and gas exploration, community resupply, mining, tourism, one of the fastest growing sectors in the region, particularly in Greenland. This portends greater human economic activity, environmental risk, and human presence within the Arctic itself, which to me I find even more profound than a seasonal shipping route, which may or may not be competitive with other alternatives.
So Terry, tell us a little bit more about how your people, the Inuit people, interact with the federal government of Canada and in turn have independence in interacting with commerce companies that are seeking to take advantage of the kinds of opportunities that Lawrence just illustrated.
Like I said earlier, we've managed to negotiate the modern treaties in Canada and have become land title holders to a large, massive area. We have 2 existing operating mines in Canada's Arctic, one just outside of Baker Lake, which is considered the geographical center of Canada, and that's a gold mine with the company Agnico Eagle, which is a Quebec-based and France-based company, as well as the other mine on the North Baffin. If you go to slide, if I can just find the slide, slide 40 again, you'll notice in the Baffin Island, which is considered, the 5th largest island in the world, just north of Quebec. On the northern tip of Baffin Island exists now an iron mine, ArcelorMittal, Dutch and Indian company, as well as an American partner, are now developing an iron mine. And the iron is Inuit iron. We own that iron. And we've successfully entered into arrangements where this company is now extracting the iron. We expect a 100+ year life of that mine, and it's at 67% grade, which is considered the highest grade iron in the world. And we are very well prepared to entertain other development, but it has to be based on our own terms. It's not development at all costs. And earlier, when people spoke about climate change, it brings the good and the bad. There's now this global, what I call the global guilty conscience, save the Arctic. People forget about the fact that we are stewards of the Arctic. We always have been and always will continue to be. And we have the advantage of 20/20 hindsight. We've seen what others have done wrong. We don't want another Gulf example.
You mean the Gulf of Mexico?
Yeah, the Gulf of Mexico and
Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah, and what I say about 20/20 hindsight is that we're able to look at, being that we've been in such an isolated area, we're able to look at what the rest of the world has done and what the rest of the world has done wrong and learn from that.
Have you put together a set of principles that would allow someone to understand how to engage with you in a conversation?
Slide 46. The Inuit have united across the circumpolar world, and we did come out with a declaration on resource development principles in Inuit Nunangat, which means the homeland. Quick little Inuktitut lesson here is I'm an Inuk, meaning a person, of the Inuit, the people. Pretty basic. And this declaration points out what we expect as a people in the circumpolar world, that they're recognizing the Arctic's great resource wealth, mindful of the core rights of Inuit, respectful of the ingenuity, resilience, and wisdom of previous generations. Keep in mind, my parents grew up in igloos and in sealskin tents in one generation. We went from Eskimo to Inuit. And that people be respectful of that. And at the same time, we're very pragmatic. We're open to discussions, and we're open to being able to work with you on how to best develop the area in a responsible and a sustainable manner.
If you could bring up slide 48, though, I'd like Torben, you and the president, and of course the other panelists, if you'd like to chime in on this. How much of this, though, if we talk about this kind of economic development, is driven by the price of oil? I mean, is this whole opportunity moot once, if and when oil trades lower? How do you see this, Torben?
Well, both the oil gas exploration and also the plans for mining activities is a play on oil and commodity prices. And here you see the oil price. Both oil and commodity prices are very volatile, and actually most people think that they are trending downwards, that the rise in commodity prices and oil prices we saw in
Slide
the last
51,
decade will, in the coming years, be reversed into a downward trend, which could make a number of projects, let's say, non-investable, or it will be hard to make the business case. If you show us slide number 49, you can see that the cost of extraction for oil in the Arctic, that is the the sixth on the slide, is relatively high compared with other areas of the world. So if we see oil prices fall to, let's say, somewhere between $60 and $80 per barrel, oil exploration in a very large part of the Arctic will not longer be of economic interest. The big difference is oil fields close to the Norwegian coast are having lower cost, but in oil exploration in Greenland is in the high range of the cost structure. So the future for both oil and gas extraction and for the mining industry in the Arctic will, to a very large extent, depend on your expectation for the long-term trend in commodity and oil prices.
Mr. President?
I think that's one of the big risks from an investor point of view.
Well, I think in this respect it's very important to realize that the Arctic consists of many different areas. And there is a certain danger in using just one term to describe these situations. You also have open oceans in big parts of the Arctic where there is relatively no risk of oil or gas drilling. And then let's not forget the big landmass of Russia. Ray and I were in Norway about a month and a half ago, where representatives of Rosneft and other Russian agencies presented an extraordinary mapping of the drilling and the mining and the oil and the gas, which is already being planned, already in operation along the Russian north in cooperation with some of the largest American corporations. So big American corporations are already engaged in the Russian side of the Arctic. And I think that in this country there's been too much of a concentration on Alaska and what your big companies are doing in Alaska, forgetting that you are already involved in the Russian side of the exploration, which has been kept relatively quiet in this country, so to speak. And then you have Greenland, which is a different story. Then you have Canada, and then you have Alaska. But there are also the ocean resources, the fishing companies, with fish becoming rarer and rarer, with many oceans becoming polluted. The purity of the Arctic oceans in different countries makes the value of the fish which is caught there higher for the environmentally conscious consumers in both America and in Europe. Then you have this extraordinary growth which you mentioned in Arctic tourism, where into this territory which was largely unknown, you have some of the biggest cruise ships companies, airlines and tourism companies now aggressively planning a big increase. It's one of the reasons why my country in the last 5 or 6 years has had up to 20% annual increase in tourism, why our airline Icelandair has had record profits in the last 4 or 5 years.
It's an excellent airline.
Because of this increasing desire of people from Asia and other parts of the world to experience the beauty of the North, the purity of the North, and so on. So the Arctic, in terms of economic activity and business opportunity, is much more than oil and gas, or even minerals. And then let's not forget that Greenland is the largest reservoir of hydropower left in the Western world. And with the possibility of cables, as Norway has now demonstrated, between Netherlands and Norway, and which we are looking into in Iceland by building a cable from Iceland to the UK, providing hydropower into the UK electricity system, because hydropower is the only power resource which you can increase the supply of if the demand suddenly increases. There is no other power resource that has this flexibility. And therefore Europe is in desperate need of access to hydropower. That's why Norway now has this strategy of becoming what they call the battery of Europe, where Europe suddenly needs, because of the fluctuations, excessive access to electricity. The Norwegians can send through the cable that power. And now there's a technological feasibility of cable from Iceland to Scotland, and thereby from Greenland to Iceland to Scotland, or from Greenland into the American continent. So if you look 20 or 30 years ahead, and that is what China and South Korea and Japan and India are doing with respect to the Arctic, it is a multi-dimensional economic playing field with a lot of opportunities, and it would be, as I said, a mistake to think it is only about oil and gas.
But it's clearly a long-term play, right, Torben?
Oh, yes, and I fully agree with the President. There are very interesting opportunities in building up the hydro capacity, because it's a very good mix with the expansion of wind energy in the northern part of Europe. So a combination of wind farms on and offshore in the North Sea and other places, and access to Norwegian and Icelandic, and maybe some time in the future, Greenland hydropower is a very attractive energy policy solution. Both is renewable, and also from, let's say, a geopolitical point of view, it's an attractive way to reduce your dependence on Russian oil and gas. So I think that's certainly something you will have to look into. But yes, it's a long. It's if you are to be an investor in the Arctic, or at least somewhere in the Arctic, you must be prepared for having very long-term horizon. Exploration of oil in the sea around Greenland will not be ready in the first 20 years or so from now. So if you are looking into these areas, you must be prepared to be there for a very long time. That's also why I stressed the need for very stable political regulatory regimes. Investors are looking for all over the world the three L's. Things have to be sufficiently large, they have to be long-term, and they have to be legal. And if we can develop projects with these qualities, long-term horizon, which matches the liabilities of pension funds, and so to say, comfortable and stable political and legal structure, I think actually we will be able to attract institutional money at a quite large scale during the coming decades.
Mr. President, you have a
Yes,
comment?
this comment about long term, because if we are saying that means 20 or 30 years, that to me is short term. I've already been president 18 years. I know many people think that's too long, but it has passed very quickly. There are 25 years since the Cold War ended. If anybody predicted then that 20 years from then China, Japan, India, South Korea, Singapore would be involved in the Arctic, nobody would have believed it. So let's realize that these 20 or 30 years time perspective that we are talking about are going to pass very quickly. And the Arctic, because of the indigenous people, is a territory where you have to show respect, where you have to be genuine. Nobody will be accepted in a rush to suddenly come in and do business all of a sudden. It's a territory that humbles you, it's tough environment, it's cold, there are people who've lived there for thousands of years. So if you want to be there 20 or 30 years from now, as an active operator, you have to start early to place yourself within that territory.
Terry, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, and then I mentioned earlier that the Inuit are a very patient group. We're very pragmatic. We've had to be in order to be able to survive in that climate. And when you look at the current Inuit statistics, I'll refer to slides, let's see here, 43. And the amount of housing shortage for our people, adjusting to the northern climate in a modern era, the permafrost, and how we can responsibly develop the area. The next slide is on food security, inadequate access to safe, nutritionally balanced, and culturally acceptable foods. The cost of food, when I say food, I'm talking about grocery bought that everyone else in this room is used to. 2/3 of our diet is based on the local bounty of the land and sea. If we didn't have that 2/3, the seal, the caribou, the whales, the polar bear, we eat polar bear, it's quite tasty, you'd see third world situations in Canada's Arctic. And it's just based on the cost of getting anything to the north. The lack of infrastructure. Everything is flown in. Next would be slide 45. The low income rates. The medium income of the Inuit is at 16,000 compared to 60,000 for non-Aboriginal populations. High rates of and underemployed Inuit, 4 times higher for Inuit adults, high cost of living, reliance on land, resources like seal, caribou, and wildlife for food and employment. A family of 4 from my home community, which is in the high Arctic, just to get down to Ottawa is at about $21,000.
Wow.
And that's just based on the fact that every community that I represent is not connected to a road system. So in Canada's north, amazing opportunity when it comes to developing the infrastructure. You built the railway from east to west, and now we're looking at going north, and amazing potential there. And we hope that the Inuit will help guide you in that aspect and to try and make it so that it's done in a responsible manner.
But Lawrence, are there examples of economic development that you think are relevant for Arctic nations to look at, to emulate, and perhaps avoid?
Yes, and the motivation for this area is out of fear, because I'm glad Terry brought up the issue of severe lack of infrastructure in the Canadian Arctic. And with regard to the long-term 20, 30-year development, that may be true for oil and gas, but it's not true for tourism, which is growing incredibly quickly. It's not true for ordinary fishing vessels, which may decide to try to approach these very dangerous waters. So one of the real growth opportunities, and I would argue needs that keep me up at night, is for search and rescue in this extremely dangerous place. And infrastructure is needed all over the place. There's no ports, there's no towns. You heard, in order to fly to Ottawa, thousands and thousands of dollars. In order to travel around the Arctic, typically you have to fly south to the capital cities and over and then back up again, because there's no transportation capability in this region. So yes, this is a growth opportunity, but it's for a negative reason. I mean, if Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 taught us a lesson, so what happens when a plane goes down? How many people, I don't know how many people flew here from Europe, but if you got a nonstop from Europe to here, I guarantee you flew over the Arctic. So what if your plane had to touch down somewhere, even if it was a how would we get help to you? This is a real problem.
May I just add an aspect which we haven't really discussed, and this is of fundamental importance, and that is scientific cooperation in the Arctic. Because what happens in the Arctic results in extreme weather patterns a few months later in the United States, in Asia and elsewhere. That's why the Chinese Polar Institute is aggressively doing expeditions and research and training young Chinese scientists on the Arctic, not because they have imperial or economic interests, but because they have discovered that the most extreme destruction in China in the last few years were caused by the melting of the Arctic sea ice. And if only a quarter of the Greenland ice sheet melts, and as the picture that you showed, it is melting aggressively, if only a quarter of the Greenland ice sheet melt, it will raise global sea levels by almost 2 meters, even if nothing happens in Antarctica or anywhere else. And that is why we need, as human beings, as societies and countries, to come together in a very extensive scientific cooperation on the Arctic. Because quite frankly, whether you are in LA or you are in Shanghai, we all live in an ice-dependent world. What happens to our cities, to our weather patterns, to our infrastructure will depend more than anything. If you want to choose a single factor in the next 40 or 50 years, the most important single factor is what happens to the ice. And we need to make this cultural and political and business shift to realize our ice dependence. Otherwise, we will make very costly mistakes in the planning of our societies and economies and our cities. So in this Arctic framework, the scientific cooperation is a very important component.
But not just obviously within the Arctic, because aren't there lessons we can learn from the Antarctic and even unexpectedly, perhaps even another region?
Well, Antarctica is a different place. There are only 2 ice-covered areas in the world where you have people and ice, where the interrelationship between people and ice is fundamentally significant. One is the Arctic that we have talked about here today. The other is the Himalayas. In the Himalayas, where you have China and India and Pakistan, you have three nuclear powers. You have all the big rivers of Asia depending on what happens to the Himalayan glaciers. You have the food production of over 2 billion people relating and relying on what happens to the Himalayan glaciers. And what I've been trying to do and have succeeded remarkably is to link the experience of the Arctic cooperation to the Himalaya region. Maybe because Iceland doesn't have a stake in the Himalaya region, so I am a non-threatening kind of player. So we have been having a number of gatherings in the last 2 years where we bring the Arctic experience to the Himalayas with the Chinese and the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Nepals and the Bhutans participating. And this is the global relevance of our success in the Arctic to help this confrontational situation in the Himalayas to come together, to realize how they are dependent on the ice. So therefore, to me, it has been fascinating to see how in a matter of few years, we have been able to bring this connection between people and ice into a completely different focus. So whereas we have talked a lot about business opportunities and infrastructure and all this, oil and gas and shipping, we have to realize that the fundamental core of all of this is the connection between people and ice, especially in the Himalayas and in the Arctic, where also the leading economies of the 21st centuries are placed, both with respect to the Arctic and the Himalayas.
Fascinating. I think we have time for some questions, so I'd like to open it to the floor. Just a quick reminder, please make them questions. If you have a statement, save them for interaction with the panelists after the session. But show of hands, any questions for the panel? This gentleman right here. We have a microphone coming. Mm-hmm. It'll come on.
If we were to visit the Inuit territories today, what kind of development would we see going on there now?
Well, in Canada's Arctic, in the Inuit communities, you have the communities, the villages, average population probably in the 500 range. And then you have the larger centers like Iqaluit on Baffin Island, Rankin Inlet in the Kuwait and Cambridge Bay on the Beaufort Sea area.
Slide 45.
And each of them are equipped with a runway and they're accessible in that manner. The only Inuit community that is accessible by road is along the Dempster to Inuvik. Now they're constructing a highway that extends to the Beaufort Sea. So now Canada will be able to truly call itself a coast-to-coast-to-coast nation and will be connected in that manner. There was another slide that showed the ice roads. In some communities you have access to that, but when you come to Canada's Arctic, treeless, we chopped them all down for firewood. No, I kid. But that's the reality of the Inuit community is
What
that
about new development? What was coming
The new development, again, the successful modern treaties, creating our own form of self-government. Government is a big industry in our region where we've established these governing bodies to manage our resources, renewable.
Specifically in mining.
Yeah,
is what you're saying.
yeah, renewable and non-renewable. But for mining, I mentioned the two mines, Agnico Eagle, and which is a gold mine, and then the iron mine in North Baffin. And there are diamond deposits on the southern tip of Baffin Island. There's known uranium deposits. There's capped wells, oil and gas in the Canadian Arctic. It's just a matter of accessibility and building the infrastructure needed to actually develop the area.
Thanks. I think we have a question over here, gentlemen.
Regarding the necessity to have cooperation from the United States or other countries, from the UN, putting that aside, is it more important to align with big corporations like Maersk and some of the oil and gas exploration companies? Because does it matter what country they align with? Because they could come from any multinational, organization. Is that where the big investment for the infrastructure, for the new harbors and new ports and any new pipelines or roads or anything like that will come from? It would be private money, right?
Torben, you want to take that first?
Well, talking about Greenland, mining activities are made by international mining companies, most of them domiciled in either UK or Australia. London Mining is the biggest potential mining company in Greenland, with a concession to extract iron ore in a very promising reserve very close to Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. Construction works are made by primarily by Danish construction companies with a long presence in Greenland. And well, you shouldn't overestimate the capacity. Greenland has 60,000, a population of 60,000 people, and a third live in Nuuk, the capital. One of the big problems or challenges is the capacity of the authorities in such a small country. To give you an idea, the Greenland Bureau of Minerals and Oil, who are to deal with companies, mining and oil companies, they have 27 employees, and capacity, civil society capacity, and government capacity is limited, and that could be that's one of the issues you have to deal with. But I think that Greenland and most of the Arctic is very open for international companies to invite them to come on. And for Greenland, there's a very long tradition for U.S. Activities. U.S. has a very large air base in the northern part of Greenland, Thule Air Base, and actually has a quite large economic impact on Greenland too. So U.S. are certainly welcome in Greenland.
Does anybody else have, Lawrence?
If I could just add to it. Actually, you asked a really important question that I'm getting a lot, and I think many of us sitting on the panel are getting a lot. And one of the key recommendations of a report that I work with a new council of the World Economic Forum about the Arctic, and we released a report at Davos in January, making some recommendation. One of the specific recommendations, slide 17. This report's available online. You can have a look at it. One of the specific recommendations was to develop ideas for a sustainable investment vehicle, which would allow people who want to invest sustainably in the region, not just within the national confines of, say, Canada, which would probably go through the Canadian banks, for example, but something more collaborative around the circumpolar north. That was one of the specific recommendations made by this group. So this is a very new idea, and certainly we would welcome any feedback you may have.
We have a question over here, the gentleman, the second row.
Mr. President, you're quite right to mention that the whole area is politically free from conflicts. But how, in that context, would you comment the Russian plan to form the Arctic forces with not only maritime component but also an army component? Well, what they are up to. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me say with respect to Russia that when I made my state visit to Russia in 2002, then Putin was president for his first go at it, so to speak. And we had a fascinating discussion on the Arctic, and I put it on the agenda. He did not put it on the agenda. And his answer at that time was, yes, it is important, but you talk to the governors of the different regions of Russia about that. Try to engage different regions of Russia. Now, however, there's been a big shift. In the last 3 years, Putin has got the Russian Geographical Society to organize every year conferences on the Arctic. I've attended all of them. And Putin has come to every one of them and made each time a major speech on the Arctic. And with all due respect to President Obama, he has not yet made a speech on the Arctic. Although the US will take over the leadership of the Arctic in about 14 months' time or so. So the Arctic has moved from being a regional issue in Russia to becoming an issue where the president not only wants to talk about it, but he engages in it. And judging from the record in the Arctic, the Russian contribution so far has been constructive. They have concluded their agreements with Norway. They had the long-standing disputes. They have, together with the American negotiators and others, led in the search and rescue agreement, in the oil spills agreement. And they have also, and I must say it surprised me to see that presentation in Norway, invited some of the biggest American oil companies into cooperation in the northern part of Russia. This is not very much spoken about in this whole dialogue between the US and Russia. So, do they have a long-term plan? I'm not sure. But I think they share with my friend here and many others from the Russian experience that the Arctic is a tough environment. And as Putin has said, even powerful countries like the US or Russia will not be able to do it alone. They need a cooperative partnership. So giving their big landmass, of course they will build up military infrastructure and capability, and so should the US. The US needs to build more icebreakers. The US needs to have more airplanes and helicopters, because despite all your emphasis on homeland security, you have not yet concentrated on the fact that due to the summer melting of the Alaskan sea ice, you have an open border, a completely open border for a few months of the year up in Alaska, where anybody on a boat can enter the United States without being checked. There was a German tourist ship that did this 2 years ago. The next homeland official or custom official or policeman or whatever you want to call it was over 1,000 miles away. So you need to realize also that there is a need for the US to build up capabilities in the Arctic, not just for the Russians.
So I mean, we have so much more to talk about. There is so much opportunity, there's so much complexity, there's a lot of excitement. I want to thank an extremely knowledgeable and distinguished panel, Mr. President, Terry Odla, Torben, and of course Lawrence, the hometown hero. Really want to thank you very much, and we encourage you all to get excited and engaged with the Institute and its activities in the Arctic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.